Mark Rogers TV back with you, continuing to bust out these videos, previewing the 2014 schedules for college football's Power 5 conferences. We've made our way through the SEC. We're in the heart of the Big Ten and, in many ways, the heartland of our fine country. Iowa, the Hawkeyes, coming off that 8-5 campaign with a bowl loss to LSU in the Outback 21-14. A bit of a down period for Iowa. They bounced back to a certain extent last year. This program has always intrigued me because Iowa cannot stay in its backyard, much like Ohio or Penn State, and certainly in the Deep South or Texas or Florida, going west to California. Iowa's got to go all over the place for football players. So they build the linebacker crew for the most part. Again, they go to Florida for linebackers, but the linebackers and certainly the offensive line and defensive front at the tackle position come from the state of Iowa, Nebraska, Illinois, but they've got to go all over the place. They've got to find football players that maybe other people are bypassing but fit the system and can be developed. Smart football players. And for the most part, Kirk Ferentz has put together a process that works for this football program that's in need of talent most of the time at the skill position players. Quarterback, although they've produced a couple NFL quarterbacks under Kirk Ferentz, think about what Iowa's accomplished in the past decade or so. Bowl wins over LSU, Florida, South Carolina, an Orange Bowl victory over Georgia Tech, a couple final top 10 national rankings, and if you go back to 2002, that Orange Bowl appearance against Carson Palmer and USC. So Iowa does it right, and they typically get it, but they have to be hitting on all cylinders in terms of recruitment and player development. Now let's look at the schedule for 2014, and the one thing that stands out that we talk about, if you've checked out our videos, is comparing conference schedules for these conferences. First looking at the SEC, now the Big Ten, then the ACC, pretty much the same format. Play everybody in your division, then who do you play in the other division? Could be key. So look at last season, two very comparable football teams, Nebraska and Iowa, went down to the final game of the season. And this is a rivalry to a certain extent that the Big Ten is pushing. Not a natural rivalry, but because of geography and the way things play out in division play, the Big Ten pushing Iowa, Nebraska, the final Friday of the regular season, right after Thanksgiving. And Iowa handled Nebraska on the road, and I was not surprised. I picked the Hawkeyes to win big, and they did, despite the lesser record going into the game. The difference in the schedule, Nebraska played Purdue and Illinois in the other division. Iowa played well against Wisconsin and Ohio State. You're talking about basically a guaranteed 2-0 for Nebraska, 0-2 for Iowa. That set up the matchup on the last Friday of the season. The Hawkeyes won it by like 3 touchdowns. Let's look at 2014 now. Northern Iowa's the opener. That's fairly traditional. That's happened a number of times in the past. Don't mind seeing that game on the schedule for Iowa. Let's see what else they have, though. They've got 3 more non-conference games before they dive into the Big Ten. They've got Ball State out of the MAC. We know that there's a long-standing relationship between the MAC and the Big Ten, and these games have become tougher for the Big Ten in recent years. This used to be about a 95% winning ratio, Big Ten versus the MAC. In recent years, it's been more like 80-85% as Minnesota's taken a dive. Purdue in recent years, and some other schools out of the Big Ten losing to the MAC. Ball State, a pretty tough opponent that took Arkansas State to the wire in the GoDaddy.com Bowl. 10-3 last season for Ball State. That will not be an easy game for the Hawkeyes, but they'll be a substantial favorite. Okay, the next 2 games, Iowa State. Iowa's got to play that game. So fill that in every year. That is a must game. It's not exactly the Iron Bowl, but for the state of Iowa, yeah, it's got to be played. It's a Big 12 versus Big 10 matchup. Got no issue with that. But that typically doesn't help Iowa in terms of strength of schedule perception. Iowa State, typically a fringe bowl team, last season 3-9. The Hawkeyes, for some reason, typically struggle against the Cyclones, much to do with the rivalry itself. So Iowa's got the superior football program, typically does on the field as well, but struggles against Iowa State. I'm guessing that they usually win 6 or 7 out of 10 years against the Cyclones, and you would think it would be higher than that. They've been upset many times, good Iowa teams, by Iowa State. So they get the Cyclones at home, week 3, rivalry game has to be played. The Cyclones coming off 3-9. Okay, so that leaves us one game, and that's at Pitt. So Pitt's come to Iowa a couple of years ago. The Panthers going to the ACC, of course, for the first time last season, finished 7-6, won a minor bowl game against Bowling Green. So Pitt's a decent opponent to put on the schedule. So Iowa puts more than one Power 5 conference team on its schedule, unlike a lot of the teams that we've looked at that have the 1 out of 4. That I hate that ratio. You've got to put 2 Power 5 conference teams on your schedule, unless you're really going out there like Michigan State and playing Oregon. Okay, but again, for Iowa, it's Iowa State and Pitt, so it's a decent non-conference schedule, but they don't play anybody exceptional. But it's Iowa. They're a fringe top 25 program. They're looking to get to the upper level of that division with Wisconsin and Nebraska. All right, so that's the non-conference. They could go 4-0. They could go 2-2. I would expect 3-1. Would not be surprised if Iowa can make it through. They're better than those football teams, but it's close against Pitt. The Hawkeyes could finish at 4-0 non-conference. Then they go to the Big Ten. And again, let's look at the non-division games. Okay, they've got a date with Indiana, the second Big Ten game. That's at home. Then they travel to Maryland. So you've got a Big Ten game, Iowa and Maryland, separated by what, 2,500 miles? That's a Big Ten matchup now. And so Iowa did pretty well, unlike last season with Wisconsin and Ohio State. Indiana, Maryland, nothing daunting there. But it will be a difficult win to go to Maryland and come out of College Park with a win. So to start the Big Ten play, at Purdue, Indiana, at Maryland. Northwestern, the Wildcats, who knows what to expect from them. 10-3 2 years ago, won their first 4 last season. A lot of impressive wins sprinkled in that stretch. Vanderbilt a couple times, Syracuse, non-conference, and some big wins within the Big Ten. But Northwestern on the downside at the end of last season at 1-7. Pat Fitzgerald's team looks to be a fringe bowl team with about 6 wins. All right, then Iowa gets into the heart of it and really finish off with a flurry. If they're in contention, the last 2 games of the season should be really nice to watch. So Northwestern at Minnesota, at Illinois, got to win both those games. I know Minnesota came back to 8-5 last season and really were a feel-good story, but Iowa should beat Minnesota. Even Iowa struggling around 500 at the time last season, early in Big Ten play, went to Minnesota, took care of the Gophers, wasn't even a contest, 23-7, clamped down on that offense. So I would expect much of the same this season. So at Minnesota, at Illinois, those are 2 must-wins, because then the Hawkeyes close out with the teams that they hope to be competing for division championship with. Wisconsin and Nebraska, both at home. Wisconsin could have some problems on defense, although I've heard some rumblings that the backups at linebacker are much better athletically than what they've replaced in Borland and company. So Wisconsin, let's see how good the Badgers are. We would expect 9 to 10 wins out of Wisconsin this season. They've got to start with LSU, of course. Then we've got Nebraska minus Taylor Martinez, but Amir Abdullah, one of the best backs in the nation. Kenny Bell, wide receiver. The Huskers have been inferior on defense in recent years. The Black Shirts are touted to be much better, led by, of course, Randy Gregory. So looking forward to down the stretch, let's say Iowa after 10 games is, 8-2? That's not a stretch. Actually, this team, we would expect them to trip up at some point, but they will be favored probably in all these first 10 games. Let's see how Maryland fares the first 5 or 6 games. Iowa could be a slight underdog on the road at College Park, but otherwise, and at Pitt, possibly an underdog. That's kind of a toss-up game on the road, but the Hawkeyes would be favored at a neutral site or at home. So through the first 10 games, Iowa could be a favorite in every game. They could win every game. Now, should they trip up? Probably once or twice. But if they're 9-1, 8-2 going into those last 2 games, and more importantly, within Big Ten play, only 1 loss at that point, the Wisconsin and Nebraska games will be huge in deciding a division championship in the West. All right, Iowa fans, would love to hear what you have to say about the Hawkeyes in this schedule. I think it sets up pretty well for a showdown with Nebraska at the end for a possible division championship if one of them can knock off the Badgers. Let's talk about it right here on Mark Rogers TV.